Good evening. Marcy, can you take your seat, please? There's comfy seats at the front. Strange thing about putting comfortable seats is everyone always then sits in the uncomfortable ones. So those who don't know, my name's Jonathan Michie. I'm the college president, so very warm welcome to Kellogg College. It's an absolute pleasure and delight to have Professor William Barnett over from Stanford. I was going to describe his various Stanford roles, but fortuitously they're all on the slide here, so you can read them for yourself. But actually, the most important one isn't yet on there, because Professor Barnett has actually designed, created, and is now delivering the first run of what's planned to be an Oxford-Stanford global program on innovation, sustainability. So I'm very grateful for him for having done that, and having witnessed some of this today. It is really impressive. We hope that's going to be a regular feature. So William is going to talk a while, and we'll allow some time for Q&A at the end, but we'll leave that for Ben to do, and then there'll be drinks following that, at which you can ask any questions you don't have a chance to during the main session. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks so much, President Michie, and I'm honored to be here. Thank you, Michie, for your good work. And I was told initially that I should stand there, but I have never stood during a talk in my life, so they are allowing me to move. Let's start by shutting that off, because it makes me really uptight, because it reminds me of the things I'm supposed to be working on. So I'd like this to be a conversation as much as possible. I only have some slides because I wanted to show some photographs, because I think seeing the people who I'm talking about can help a little bit with sort of fleshing out the message. I'm not an expert in sustainability, and I'm very late in life coming to it. I've always wanted to study sustainability. I have a whole speech, which is ready for St. Peter, to explain why it is that it took me so long to do this. But life sort of happens, and you'll know what you are when you see what you do. And at some point I found myself a professor at the Stanford Business School, running the Stanford Executive Program, helping companies sell things. And there's just a tremendous amount of momentum in an academic career. So those of you who are in academia know that. And I had several brushes with moving across the divide, helping create what's now the Woods Institute of the Environment, and several others. And then in 2019, I was asked to just give advice to a bunch of scientists and engineers who were going to create a school of sustainability at Stanford. And I thought, well, look, at this point, if I don't do it, like, how many times are you going to have a chance to do this? So I completely moved into it. What was interesting, the quandary I found myself facing, been teaching sustainability now with Chris Field for going on my 4th year, and had a bunch of new research projects, and I chair a department over in the school, so I have all these colleagues. The big quandary is industrial transformation and organizational change, which happens to be what I've studied my entire life. So I don't know, this retrospective rationalization, is that what it is? But it all makes sense now that I should be thinking about this. I'm going to take it as a given that since industrialization, we have been producing massive amounts of carbon dioxide, and that has changed our world. In fact, I'll tell my story of when I came to realize this. I was 12. The students who are in my class know this because it's the opening to the chapter I made you read of my book with Chris Field. I was 12 years old. Now that was 1970, so I don't know what you were doing in 1970, but I was 12 years old, and I was in a middle school, and we had a substitute teacher. you know what that means, right? You're gonna act up and you're gonna have fun. And so they made us have little name tags, as you do when there's a substitute teacher, so they know who you are. And our teacher looked so young, and he came in holding, I still vividly remember, he came in holding all these materials that he had obviously been given to teach the class. You know, like that he was fresh out of teaching college. And I don't remember his name. I wish I could remember his name. But he stood up, he looked at the class, and he took the materials, he put them down, and he said, well, forget about that. He said, I'm going to teach you something you need to know. Now, this is 1970. So that's the year of the first Earth Day. But you have to also remember that in, was it 64, Rachel Carson, was that 64? So it was a time when, if you remember Silent Spring, if you haven't read Silent Spring, you should read it. Rachel Carson doesn't really talk about climate change. And climate was not synonymous with sustainability. We talked a lot about pollution, overpopulation. There were things like that that we talked about. So what this young teacher was saying was very different. Turns out it was in the science since at least 1896, which is the first paper that predicts climate change as a function of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's been well known for a very long time in the scientific community. This teacher got up and drew the globe. We used chalk back then. I'd have to describe it to the younger people here, but it's really handy for showing an atmosphere. Use the side of the chalk. And so he depicted the rays of the sun coming in, and then, you know, the greenhouse effect and so forth. And as he described this and then showed the probable patterns of global warming, the bell rang, and everyone ran out to recess, except me. And I just sat there and looked at it. And he came over, of course, right away he's worried, you know, with the teachers looking at it, like, oh no, what have I done? You know, he's looking, they weren't saying climate anxiety back then, but yeah. So those of you who teach this subject, you know that look in the eyes of your students. And he comes over, he says, oh, Billy, why don't you go out and play with the other kids? And I don't remember his name, but I addressed him, you know, and I said, you know, this seems really important. I will never forget that, because it just did. It just seems like this is going to happen. This seems important. He says, oh, yeah. This is important, he said. But you're not going to have to worry about it until you're really, really old. So here I am. Yeah, he's right. I got old, and now we're seeing its results. And I would encourage, probably most people by self-selection come to an audience like this, come to a talk like this, you're probably already well aware of the literature, but you should stay up on it because we're updating the literature, and those ranges of prediction, we're really on the not so pleasant end of the predictions. So we do know what's going on in our environment. And it's not just about carbon or the other greenhouse gases, it's really about all of the planetary boundaries. And students in my class here, some of you know about the planetary boundaries, it's actually what we'll be discussing Friday. So, but the various dimensions on which our activities affect the Earth, from phosphorus and nitrogen, which is in vast quantities now because of the agricultural revolution, to the acidification of the ocean, of course, carbon and climate change, but also loss of biodiversity, which of course leads to issues of food security and water. All of these challenges are coming at once. And they're coming whether we like it or not. So this isn't an issue where we're told something and we get a choice whether we like what we hear. But this is the reality that we need to face. I'll often have people say, give me some good news. I would prefer that you have the truth. If you're looking for inspiration, look at the fact that brave men and women all around the world are dealing with this now. Many of you are, and those of you who aren't can join us. And you can feel empowered by virtue of taking action rather than by selectively ignoring reality. Okay, so it's very important because how we cope with this is a very deeply personal thing, but it's very important that we do it in a way where we're still connected to reality. I'll be getting to this in a minute. Most people's initial response is to think of their own culpability as a consumer. Oh my gosh, I eat meat. I flew on an airplane to get here, and so forth. I do think you should behave yourself as an environmental consumer. But I worry. Palo Alto is filled with Palo Alto, or Stanford University is filled with people who are excellent performative environmental consumers. And I know that sounds cynical, maybe it is, but it is very real. That people can feel sanctimonious and they still have the carbon footprint of Tyrannosaurus Rex. When it comes down to it, the action we have to take is not only as consumers, but especially as producers, what we do in our jobs. And it might be something as direct as what honored to have Karen McClellan here and a number of you who take direct action in terms of what you've done in your life. But it may also be indirect in terms of helping your organization to move in the direction that we will go when it comes to sustainability. In fact, I'm incredibly optimistic, super bullish on sustainability, not because I'm not a realist, but because this is the first time we have faced a moment of industrial revolution and we saw it coming. Let me explain, okay? And so this is a little bit dangerous because this is what I spent my life studying, so then I could go into a really long and boring, so get up and leave if I go down that road, okay? And that'll signal it to me. But there have been a number of industrial revolutions over time, and many of you may have read, there are plenty of industrial histories and historians who've labeled different kinds of grand long-term changes over time. And no, I knew it would come up, but I was just gonna wait. But that's okay. We'll leave it up there. We'll get to that. I guess we could start for our purposes with a relatively recent revolution that came at the end of the 19th century, that many historians refer to as a mechanization revolution. The earliest part of the Industrial Revolution, written about in Hard Times, you read Dickens, but of course, the entire world experienced this, although it wasn't always as documented as well as Dickens documented it. And these were tremendous changes. These were the changes that gave us the social theorists like Karl Marx, who were trying to make sense out of the disruption that they were looking at. And that revolution of industrial production, a revolution in mechanization, caught the status quo entirely by surprise. And if you look at the historical record on organizational births and deaths, there was a mass extinction of organizations. Craft production as we know it was completely displaced by industrial production. And the people involved, that would have been my grandfather, many of your great-grandfather, found it was completely unexpected. You could not have seen it coming. And only in retrospect have we been able to make sense out of it. More recently, all of us are at the tail end of the digitization revolution, which came along in the 20th century, obviously, with computer technology and information technology more generally. Lots of you have read the work of Professor Clay Christensen, the late, great Professor Clay Christensen, an engineer by training himself, who noted that the status quo didn't see it coming. That's what makes his ideas around disruption so profound. The people who were the experts in these industries didn't see it coming. You know, I went to the archives when I was studying the computer industry and found exchanges among a set of computer scientists at Stanford who were designing what would be the internet. And they came to the conclusion that it was possible to build a massive multi-node network. They had other words in there, but it was basically the internet. But then they were also saying, but why would we need it? There are only a few hundred scientists in the world who need this. Why would you need the internet? Even the designers of the internet didn't think we needed the internet. And I remember in 1993, I had Bruno De Leon in my classroom. He was a software entrepreneur. Now, 1993, the internet existed, but we didn't yet have browsers to have a World Wide Web on the internet. So the software side of the deal hadn't been created. The creators of the original Mozilla browser were creating it in 1993. And I was teaching entrepreneurship at the Stanford Business School. So I was doing a case study of a French company called Fitz. 8 Frenchmen came over from Toulouse. They were disappointed because they had seen Baywatch, but they were in Northern California. But that's another story I won't go into. These 8 Frenchmen I met in an Italian restaurant in Scotts Valley as they were bemoaning their move from Toulouse. And so I wrote a case study about them. Bruno comes to class, and we're talking about how you make a term sheet and how you get financing and all that. And Bruno gets up and says, at the end of a class at Stanford in entrepreneurship, you typically have the entrepreneur get up and do a little Q&A. So he gets up with that beautiful French accent. And he says, now this is 1993. Internet doesn't exist. He says, I envision a future where computers will be very small. And he picks up some small item, small enough to fit in your pocket. And the major use of the computer will be to exchange photographs. And the students, they're looking at him. They're looking at me like, where'd you get this guy? And I got so panned, they wrote in their how they at Stanford, the students grade you, right? So they, they wrote like, where did this guy's crazy. What is he talking about? By the way, 10 years later, they would write that about Mark Zuckerberg too when he visited my class. So I don't know. There's a consistent pattern here where we don't see it coming, right? We don't see it coming. We didn't see it coming. And when somebody gets it right, like Bruno De Leon, we think he's crazy. It's important for me to emphasize this because the digitization revolution happened. It happened despite a lack of good policy. Yes, there was lots of investment, but not good policy. And it happened despite the fact that the status quo both opposed it and didn't understand it. And therefore, there has been a mass extinction of companies. Failure rates skyrocketed throughout the digitization revolution. And today's incumbents, the new status quo, were the disruptive firms that were part of that revolution. So let's talk about another revolution. Let's talk about the sustainability revolution. The first thing we have to realize when it comes to the sustainability revolution is the fact that we began with, and I'm not going to have a bunch of words on a slide, but this is the one fact I want us to begin with. I'm not going to show you all the graphs, but we have to understand that it has been through our ability to conduct large-scale, organized production and consumption that we have ushered in a new era. It is the latest and the last, at least for humanity. By the way, the Earth's going to be fine. It's not about the Earth, about us, of our geological epochs. Our existential challenge now is to redesign our organized production and consumption activities in a way that is environmentally sustainable. Okay, that is our call. So my generation gave you mass production and consumption. The 21st century is when we will master sustainable production and consumption. Now, how can I be so sure? look, the mechanization revolution and the digitization revolution were optional. They were optional. You'll hear people say, oh, but it's too late. Well, think that through. What's the counterfactual? If we do nothing, the feedback from the earth just gets louder. So the counterfactual is not what you're seeing now. The counterfactual is many tens of millions more deaths than we would have otherwise seen. So since the earth will give us that feedback, at some point we will get the message. So we know that the new steady state will be a steady state of sustainable production and consumption. That is what the new steady state will be. Now, here's what's interesting. When you look at the records of entrepreneurs during both the mechanization revolution and the digitization revolution, they envisioned a reality that didn't exist yet. Schumpeter wrote of creative destruction being powered by entrepreneurs that did something that made no sense. Because they're envisioning a reality that doesn't yet exist. The unit economics of the sustainability revolution don't make sense. That is a business opportunity. Now, it may upset you that I've just talked about tens of millions of deaths being a business opportunity. But it is. If you're on the vanguard of finding a way to produce food for hungry people, or to provide clean water for thirsty people, or to get medicine to people in need of medicine, or to provide any of the goods and services that make life happen in a world where others are unable to do it, that is good for humanity, and it is a business opportunity. It just is. We live in a capitalist world, and the best of the capitalists try to seize on such business opportunities. And the reason I take this approach to talking about it is that it's common for people to instead take the approach that says, be good. I do think you're being good when you help to usher in the sustainability revolution, but you would do it even if you didn't want to be good, because it is where our economy is going. That's the reasoning that I'm following here. And to make this a little more real, let's talk about the sustainability revolution. I looked at how much time we have, and I decided I would settle on just a few of the areas where there would be disruptive business opportunities. So I figured I could get through 6. The good news is it's just pictures, so it's easy to tolerate. Okay, but let's start. So we know there's going to be net zero carbon emissions. When I say net zero, it's likely be net, it almost certainly will need to be net negative, meaning that we go not only to dramatically decreased carbon release in our productive system, but that we also have means of carbon capture and sequestration. We know that we have to adapt the biosphere. So we'll talk about food, water, and biodiversity. And the circular economy, which we already have going, is going to become more dramatic. So let's start with net zero carbon emissions. And by the way, you can always throw your hand up because I like to do it that way, especially now that I'm through with the preacher part. And now on net zero carbon emissions, I'm going to show the only graph I think I show. You can always, these are always all over the internet. It's just a McKinsey plot. And the way to understand this is that, so this is just a plot that shows how we keep getting our estimates of future technology wrong. And this is not just for wind and offshore, onshore and offshore wind. It's true for technology generally. We tend to consistently underestimate what we're capable of. So if you go way back, we were projecting that we would be here. And as historical time goes on, we keep correcting the projection. And this same pattern goes on in technology after technology. We have trouble seeing past what exists today. So if you have an idea that is pertinent to sustainability and you tell an expert, one way they will burst your bubble is to say that the unit economics don't work. Because it's almost always true that when you're not in equilibrium, it will look like it's impossible. But what you do should be according to what's in the future, not according to what was true in the past. Unfortunately, we have trouble with this. And then, of course, when the world changes, we retrospectively rationalize those changes and we forget how wrong we were. So that'll be the pattern. And this gives us tremendous hope. I'll give you some examples. So this is a really cool area in northern Denmark up near Aalborg. So it takes a while to get up there, but it has a tremendous number of wind turbines, courtesy of Henrik Stiesdal, the inventor of the wind turbine, who's Danish. And that's not Henrik, that's Eddie, a scientist there at Green Lab. And this is an entire area up in northern Denmark that is powered by wind, being right there on the North Sea. And where that wind power is then used for a variety of different experimental built to scale green businesses. Now, right now, I want to acknowledge that there are about as many people in Denmark as there are in a middle-sized Chinese city. Okay, I get it. Denmark's small. It's not that Denmark is going to be the economy where these technologies scale. It's that Denmark is the hotbed of innovation for many of these technologies. And when we scale them, we'll be scaling them in much bigger countries. And we'll talk about an example of that in just a second. And now we'll go back to Denmark when we get to circular economy, and we'll talk about that plant right over there. I just want to signal that. So let's shift to talking about renewable power. I was telling my students about this particular visit. I wasn't allowed to have the picture taken in that direction when I was at POSCO's Finex plant, because behind me over there is their hydrogen steel plant. Because in the new economy, we're going to need steel. And POSCO is aware of that. Now, POSCO has always had the problem that they're visionary. So after World War II, when POSCO it was recreated, but it was essentially created. Or I'm sorry, after the Korean War, when POSCO was essentially recreated, they were supposed to engage in low-cost steel production because they had a labor force that was a low-cost labor force, and the economists all told them, well, you should be doing low-cost steel production. And they said, no, we have the vision to be the world's most technologically sophisticated steel company. And all the experts laughed at that, of course. And within 25 years, they were the world's most technologically sophisticated steel company. And they invented the Finex system, which upset steelmakers all over the world, especially in the United States and Germany, where people fancied that they were good at this, because in fact, the Finex system is much more efficient. And their new Finex system is powered by hydrogen. And I love the Koreans. In fact, I was introduced to Korean industry through Mazi Zaraparvar, so thank you, Mazi, including POSCO, whatever it was, 30 years ago. But I love the Koreans because the reason they were worried about a picture of that is that Hyundai Steel, who's across the street, would see it. So they had this wonderful kind of internal competition that powers their innovations. Now look, at first, that steel will not be green hydrogen steel, but once we get to green hydrogen, you'll be looking at steel production that would be consistent with a net zero strategy. And that's an incredible innovation. And you're looking at something that is existing today. So not something in some dreamed about far off future. Here's one of my favorite oceanographers, Peter Domenical. I think my favorite oceanographer has to be Fiorenza Micheli at Stanford, just because she's at Stanford, and that the whole oceans group at Stanford has this very kind of Italian sprezzatura feel to it. So you got to go to Hopkins and see these people. It makes you want to be an oceanographer. Now look what they're doing. See this great big thing? And you see that right there? You see the little red dot? That's the nose of a drone. So they're putting in place in the Northern Atlantic a measurement system to measure the uptake of carbon dioxide into the ocean. So the ocean is constantly absorbing carbon dioxide. If we could accelerate the absorption of carbon dioxide by the ocean enough that it absorbed all of the carbon dioxide that we have released since the beginning of industrialization, it would not increase the proportion of carbon dioxide in the ocean by even 1%. The ocean is so vast that the carbon dioxide that is troubling us so much in our atmosphere is nothing once it's sequestered, if it could be sequestered. And it turns out ocean scientists all over the world are working on this project, but the problem is measurement. When they take the money people out and they say, hey, look, we have a new technology that accelerates the absorption and sequestering of carbon dioxide in the ocean, and then they put their project out there. They can show it in the lab, but out in the ocean, how do we know it's working? You have to have a measurement system, because everyone's worried about the environmental equivalent of a Theranos. You have to be able to see it. So this measurement system that Peter's describing will allow scientists to show the effects of what they're doing. Now, you students in my class, we've been talking about the importance of carbon credits. The way you monetize this is through a contract that then takes the sequestered carbon and monetizes that through a carbon market, so that you pay for this network by giving them a piece of the action in all of the experiments that are run on this system, just like we did with SRI at Stanford during the digitization revolution. So in fact, we introduced to Peter the lawyers who had created the contracts around SRI that gave us much of the Silicon Valley to do the same thing here for ocean sequestration. Super exciting possibilities for greenhouse gas removal. Can we talk about adaptation and food? That's another area where there's a great deal of change. The climate change is already upon us. And of course, that means that the food and water situation is changing in terms of its geographic distribution and in terms of the biodiversity implications. So let's look at food in our changing world. This is the coast of Chile. Do you like all my hats, by the way? Yeah, I didn't mean it to be a tour through my hats, but I'll even show you the hat that was my favorite hat that is now on the floor of San Diego Bay, because I went sailing. But anyway, so here I am on the coast of Chile with Professor Fernandez. Miriam is one of the partners we're working with to teach a course similar to the one we're teaching here, President Michie, but to do it in Chile. The problem we have here is that the salmon are moving south. Now, the reason I'm looking at your faces is some of you will know that salmon are not indigenous to that area, so therefore it's become very controversial among American environmentalists who would prefer that the world remain as it was, except for where they live. The people in Chile are upset about the American environmentalists because they're surviving on those salmon. And they have a massive salmon industry, but the trouble is the salmon are moving south. So the fisher folk we met with were dismayed because they don't know what to do about it. And it means they have to now be geographically mobile to follow the fish or farm the fish. And Miriam is working on systems that will help them to do both. And it's very interesting to look at how we help the people in the industries that are affected. If you look in the latest issue of Nature magazine, the journal Nature, you see an article by Javier Basurto and his colleagues, one of my colleagues at Stanford, who studied small-scale fisheries. And it turns out that while they're small-scale individually, collectively they account for the lion's share of fish production in the world. Agribusiness is also very important in fishing, but it's especially difficult for the small-scale fisheries to adapt And Professor Fernandez is helping, along with a bunch of other people in the oceans world, to track the changing location of fish. And the same dynamics are happening in on-land production. Think the wine industry, look at production of grain, the production of all sorts of foodstuffs is changing in its location. There are also issues around water. And so here we are in the Negev desert. Do you like the COVID beard, by the way? Should I have kept it? I don't know. So, so this is Alon Bengal, and Dr. Bengal is an expert on drip irrigation. Now, the Israelis have always had a problem with water, right? Because you have the Sea of Galilee, but it's a limited amount of water, and the levels are dropping in the Sea of Galilee, and then you're surrounded by neighbors who really don't want to share. And so you're in a situation where you have to deal with water. So they've come up with technologies for desalination. But importantly, these crops here are all experiments in drip irrigation. And there's a kibbutz, right? Not far from where we are in this picture, the kibbutz Hatterim, which is where they developed, where the company Netafim was born. And if you drive through California, you see all the drip irrigation, that's all Netafim. Southeast Asia, you see drip irrigation, Netafim. Born in Israel to solve that problem, but it turns out drip irrigation dramatically conserves water while not giving us the negative side effects that were true for the irrigation systems of the 1960s. By the way, because it's drip irrigation and not flood irrigation, we don't see methane releases. And methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas that unfortunately is typically released in mass when we have flood irrigation. And so we were actually going to do a study trip there as well, but that turned into, that's just a few miles from the Hamas war, so we have to wait until, well, we can't do that for now. Yes, okay, I was really glad to have survived, because if you look down through that bridge, those holes, it's a long drop, I can tell you. This is right near Mount Pinatubo. And now let's talk biodiversity, and students will be studying biodiversity on Friday. Biodiversity is not nice to have, it's essential. And the fact that we appear to be on the verge of a mass extinction should cause us concern. Because we could get a lot of other things right. The techno-optimists could be right, and we would still have a big problem on biodiversity. So when you hear that there are problems with the coral reefs, for example, that is an existential challenge to humanity, because so much of the rest of the biosphere relies on the biodiversity that emanates from coral reefs. So those are not just things we wish we could keep, like the dodo bird, but they are indicators of a much deeper problem with our need to have biological diversity for our species to continue to flourish. Turns out that traditional indigenous knowledge has been looking at biodiversity for a very long time, and in particular, the regrowth of forests. So all around the Clark Air Force Base, the American military, the Clark Air Force Base in this part of the Philippines is no longer an Air Force base, but because of the American presence, the American military brought in our scientists who've had a lot of trouble regrowing the rainforests in that area, which were devastated by the eruption of Mount Pinatubo. Turns out the Aeta people, on whose land I am there, we developed a relationship with the Aeta people, and one of their tribal members, James, and I'm not remembering his last name. Do you remember James's last name?
It's King.
Yeah, James King, that's it. Yeah, thank you. By the way, it's Marissa Mendoza. She leads our sustainability initiative at Stanford on the staff side. And she comes to make sure we know who you are, so that you can continue to come to our conferences and our Changemaker events. And basically, she tries to make it that our relationships are not one and done. So, so seek out Marissa over drinks when we get done here. But James King is himself a biologist, so he's a member of the Aeta people, he's a member of the Aeta tribe, but he's also a professor of biology. And so what he's been doing is taking traditional knowledge from the Aeta and then applying that to reforest these rainforests. And you Stanford students who know Rodolfo Durso, Rodolfo was there with me and he was blown away. He was crawling around on the ground saying, "Bill, look, they knew to plant legumes," you know, it was just so great. So some of us get excited about industrial evolution, some of us get excited by legumes, right? I mean, this is the way of the world. But all of this rainforest was regrown much more rapidly because of the combination of traditional indigenous knowledge with scientific knowledge. And it's also much more respectful of the people who live in these places because this is of them, this is where they live, and they have an understanding of their environment that is deeper than that of the scientists who might visit from afar. And so the hope is that in the future, well, I'll tell you some more about this. In fact, let's go to, oh, right. So let's talk about coral. So Monig is showing me where the fisher folk off of Palawan were dropping dynamite to blow up fish. That's really not good for the coral. And so these little huts have been built, see little solar panels up there. These little huts have been built where they can stand guard to keep the dynamiting, people from dynamiting the rare sea coral. And in fact, the preservation of sea coral is a very interesting case study. It's not clear what we're going to do. Some of my colleagues have discovered super coral. These are coral that thrive even as the temperature goes up. So what's going on with the bleaching of corals is not because of bleach. The bleaching of coral happens because as the temperature of the water goes up, the little symbiotic relationship that exists between the coral and the little organism inside the coral gets upset. Because the little organism inside, when the temperature goes up, starts giving off a more acidic effluent. And the coral doesn't like that and spits it out. And then that ends up bleaching the coral and soon the coral dies. And this is what's happening to most of the coral in the world right now. Super coral are adapted to warmer water. So one question we face is, do we want to take those super coral and put them in places like Palawan or Australia or in other places where the coral that now exists is dying? And it's a big question. Are we as gods, as E.O. Wilson would put it? I'm not sure what the answer to that is. But the state of the coral is where we see a lot of attention being paid in places like the Philippines right now. So I talked about these as business opportunities, and let me show you this business opportunity. Okay, now, which ones are the scientists? Oh, there's the hat, by the way, that I lost in San Diego Bay. I love that thing, yeah. And so anyway, there's the scientist and there's the scientist. And so Ruby and Nomiya are showing me and introduced me to this member of the local tribe. And I can't pronounce his name very well, so I don't try. So it's Yapashoni, I think. But the Tucano tribe in this part of the Amazon makes money by harvesting rare mushrooms that get a great price in Korea and Japan and throughout Southeast Asia, but especially in the Korean and Japanese markets. This is agroforestry. A lot of people don't realize that the Amazon has over 700 urban areas, which are trading centers for indigenous people and Amazonians, in fact, of all walks of life, who are trying to make a living. And many of those people are now trying to do it through agroforestry. And in fact, many people in the Amazon are upset about the fact that American environmentalists would, as one person put it to me, prefer that we wall off the Amazon now that you're done industrializing, right? And so, because the people most responsible for the problems we're facing are not the people of the Amazon, they're people of the United States, people of Europe. And so it's really heartening, you go to a place like this, you see what people are doing that gives them a livelihood and preserves the biodiversity of the rainforest. It really leaves you feeling empowered. Let's talk about the circular economy. So, plastic's a problem, right? Because we love plastic. By the way, we invented plastic to solve an environmental problem. So plastic was invented because we were killing elephants to make ivory for pianos. And so a couple of different companies cooperated with what would become Monsanto to invent a new key made of a material that felt a lot like ivory and billiard balls. And now everything, right? It's plastic you're wearing, but many of you are wearing plastic clothes. You wouldn't leave your house without your plastic phone, and so forth. So dealing with plastics is a big challenge. Here I am at Suzano, the world's largest paper company, and here's a plastic diaper actually made of paper so that it's fully biodegradable. Synthetic plastics are on the horizon, but we clearly have to deal with plastic. And the plastic problem gets even worse when we get to some of the poorest parts of the world where small plastic sachets are used to buy products because people can't afford to buy products with larger packaging. So you go swimming in the beaches of Indonesia, the Philippines, many parts of Southeast Asia, and you have to swim through a thick layer of what are literally billions of plastic sachets. And that's just one example. Most of the plastic is in fact invisible. It's microplastic. It's submerged below the ocean's surface and is in the food that we eat. And it's in all of our systems. So we need to do something about plastic. A number of startups coming out of the so-called ecopreneurship movement in Israel are focusing on replacing plastics. That's true in Silicon Valley as well. It's both a plague to humanity and a tremendous business opportunity for the future. So as you students, remember I told you about Elephant Tech, the additive manufacturing firm in Japan? Well, here's Shinya, who was busy, he and his wife having a baby last year. They couldn't come to our Changemaker event, but they'll come this summer. And there are those integrated circuits I told you about. So Shinya and his team of engineers at Elephant Tech invented a way to do additive manufacturing to create a microcircuit. Now, the reason this is important is that normally we produce a small amount of waste. Well, in the old, before this innovation, we would produce a small amount of waste when we would create a circuit by burning away at the surface and leaving that as a tiny amount of effluent. But we make billions of them. So the combined amount of waste is tremendous. And so Shinya reasoned that we could use 3D printing to build up the surface that we want instead of tearing down. That turned out to be a tremendous innovation that both saves money and eliminates the waste. And so last year, Apple signed a contract so that all Apple circuits will be made by this process. That immediately revolutionized the industry, right? One small entrepreneur, one innovation, and you just saw a mass extinction of the status quo in that industry. Remember, when it comes to the status quo in organizations, mass extinction is good, because that's another step away from the mass production and consumption of my generation towards the sustainable consumption and production of your generation. So every time we can destroy in my generation, your generation is coming closer to achieving its promise. I always tell my colleagues this at the School of Sustainability at Stanford, where it's very difficult because we're trying to change things. We have a motto: change lives, change organizations, change the world, but don't change Stanford. And so every time my colleagues are uncomfortable, I say, if you're feeling uncomfortable, it's a sign that we might be beginning to get it right. right? Because if you're trying to change the status quo, it doesn't happen because you're comfortable. This man has made lots of people super uncomfortable. Okay, I told you we were gonna go back to northern Denmark. So here we are at SkyClean. So this is a pyrolysis, it's in Danish, so I'll explain it to you. But so what you do is you take this company, another Henrik Stiesdal innovation, takes bio waste, burns it in an oxygen-free environment, a process known as pyrolysis. Some of you may be experts in that. And what that does is it produces what you see down here, which is biochar. 50% of the carbon in that bio waste is sequestered for 1,000 years. And that biochar, which is essentially inert and harmless, can be used to aerate soil, has some positive uses. But the important thing is that it sequesters carbon. And the other 50% of what comes out of pyrolysis is in the form of biofuels that can be used for aviation, ocean liners and shipping. Now you might say, wait a minute, that's got carbon in it. Yes, but that's carbon that already had been existing in the atmosphere that had been absorbed by the plants that were then the bio waste. Now let's go back to that paper company I was telling you about, Suzano. What if you take the 1.2 million trees that company plants every day? Right, so that company plants 1.2 million trees a day. They just planted 10,000 more trees. They just planted 10,000 more. It just blows your mind. I almost didn't believe it, but then I visited them and they took me out to these, it was like showing up on a George Lucas, like everything was massive in this company. It makes half of the world's paper in Brazil. Now it doesn't cut down virgin forest. It plants it in areas that are already deforested. But what if you took those trees, only 50% of which go into paper, the other 50% are burned to make the paper, and used pyrolysis to burn those? That would be a massive carbon sequestration. And we're working on Suzano now to adopt the Stiesdal system. If they do that, you're looking at a real change in terms of going net negative on carbon. At the same time, you get paper. And all of this from some little country whose population is no bigger than the population of a middle-sized Chinese city. Now, I've talked about this in a way that sounds so positive. It's like a business pep talk. But the reality is there's a tremendous number of people suffering because of the changes we have wrought. And we have talked about everything up to here through a purely technical or a purely behavioral lens. But we must also use a moral lens to make sense out of the ethics of what we've been doing. Because the winners and losers of the sustainability revolution have to be thought about in order for this to be pragmatic. We also should think about this because, in my opinion, that's the morally right thing to do. But even if all you cared about is what's pragmatic, you cannot ignore the pain and the environmental justice issues we face. Ask these questions: who pays, who suffers, and who benefits? And the way I put it here, that fair solutions are feasible solutions. So that's a pragmatist orientation as opposed to a moral philosophical orientation. And that would include both respecting indigenous people and thinking about the consequences of the changes that are going on, which are already a reality for billions of people. The fires in Los Angeles got a great deal of attention recently. Less attention in North America was paid to the millions and millions and millions of people in the floods in Pakistan just a year ago. Now, I'm not trying to equate or say one person's misery is any worse than another. I'm just trying to say that globally, the need to adapt is here now. It's not for the future. This is not something on the horizon. It's already with us. And we know from the projections that the things we're seeing are only going to become more intense. So let's take this example. So these are the Jaramillo sisters who had, I guess, what was the first plane flight of their life. We brought them to Stanford we're trying to get our colleagues at Stanford to pay attention to some of these issues, so we're bringing change makers in there. So we, of course, met with them and talked with them in Chile, and they told us about, in fact, that flag is very controversial in Chile because it's considered a terrorist flag, but it's the flag of the Mapuche. But there are millions of Mapuche people in Chile. There used to be millions in Argentina, but there had been a genocide. There's still millions in Chile. They explained that they have traditional practices where they have fished and farmed for years that are being destroyed by the pollution of the factories that have come in because of the industrialization of Chile. And all they want is for those factories to stop dropping the pollution into the rivers there. Now, what was interesting is we then went down and met with some entrepreneurs who were down in forget the city, Puerto Montt, down more south, who had come up with a process that would treat that effluent so that it wouldn't pollute the river. But their customers are all in the Sacramento River in California. And they weren't paying any attention to this problem of the people in their own country. I mean, we made those introductions, but the point is there are plenty of opportunities for those kinds of changes that would help these brave women and their tribe to continue to make a living in the way they have for longer than the colonialists have been in Chile. This is Rizal de los Santos, and we visit Rizal every year to see how he's doing. He's in the streets of Pasig, Manila. Now, this was him in 2022. This was him. This was that same street 3 weeks later. Okay, and these super typhoons hit Chile on a regular basis at increasing intensity, so much higher rainfall density and frequency because of climate change. And they've all gone with 2-story buildings because their adaptation, if you want to call it that, is moving upstairs. Okay, and that's not the right way to go. The government, then, this is the following year, the government helped them to recover. Now there's Rodolfo Durso, the ecologist I told you about. You see all those people in his glasses? There are a bunch of MBA students over here who are meeting with Rizal, and in fact, who still communicate with them after their study trip. It's a win, but it's a temporary win because we don't know whether or not the infrastructure that's now been fixed is going to keep them safe from these super typhoons. But these are the adaptations that have to happen for environmental justice to exist. This is me just a few months ago with Asmania in Indonesia. Do you see the white here? This is dead coral. But it's not bleached. It was actually coral that was right there. But the Indonesian government had started a project without the permission of the people who live there to dig that coral out and create a port, which ended up a failed project, and they left this mountain of dead coral. And she's showing us this because she and her people now are having trouble fishing there, because when you destroy the coral, you destroy where the fish come from. And so we'll be taking a student study trip there to meet with her and hear her story. She is an incredibly brave woman. When I asked her how I could talk about her to you, she said, "You can call me a defender of Pari Island." Okay, now, when people say environmental justice to you, I want you to think of her. So that's what it's about. This is a very real battle. So this is what I want to leave you with. These changes are happening. These changes are going to happen even if the policymakers don't help. And these changes are going to happen despite the status quo, not because of it. You can join in this revolution. I know, you young people, that your generation will be known as the greatest generation. Your generation will be the generation that gives us sustainable consumption and production. It has to be. There is no counterfactual. Thank you. By clock time, we're supposed to drink. But by event time, I should take a few questions and then we'll go drink. Does that sound good? Okay, just, yeah, so any questions, comments? Please.
So,
Here, let me. Oh, you've got one. Okay, great.
thank you. Thank you so much for your talk. So I kind of I'm very passionate about sustainability from an engineering biology perspective and
Yes.
engineering living organisms to degrade plastic, etc., etc. I think the problem though that exists is that even if we do create sustainable dyes to dye clothes or alternative proteins, what happens is these products end up in Western supermarkets like Waitrose, etc., and they're kind of accessible to people who are more what I'm trying to say is these products are not actually going to have an impact on the people that are suffering from climate change.
Yeah, yeah,
So it's just like the person from Elephant Tech that made that deal with Apple.
yes.
That's amazing that he made money and made a more sustainable product.
Yes, yes,
but
yes.
that is not going to impact the people of Indonesia.
Yeah, that's a
What do you say
great,
to that?
that's a great point. Thank you for that. So the way industrial evolution happens is that when you see the transformation in terms of new firms coming in and old organizations dying, the penetration of those new products and services into the world economy still takes time. So the initial buyers of the more sustainable products are typically going to be high socioeconomic status consumers. So initially, sustainable products are a luxury good. Okay, but the importance is not who buys them initially. The importance is, are we destroying the status quo? Because the new status quo then converts to the whatever that product or service is. So ultimately, the entire world economy moves in that direction. So you don't maintain the old economy once the new economy comes along. It can take a very long time. If we had more progressive environmental and industrial policies, that transition would happen even faster. And so I'm with you on that. And I emphasize these breakthroughs not so much to celebrate the immediate kind of successes of someone like Shinzo, but rather to focus on the fact that we're changing. And we're changing from one steady state to another. That's the best I can do on that. That's a hard question. So why don't we just move on along? You're next, and then you. So go ahead.
Hi, I have a question on the role of markets and policy and making that transition of the
Yes.
global world economy to a net zero economy happen. And I'm going to introduce or provide some more context to my thinking. Talk a little bit about my background. For the past 3 years, I've been working for McKinsey.
Okay.
So I've had access to boards across industries.
Yes.
And of course, the biggest corporations in the world, they have officially at least stated that sustainability is one of their major strategic priorities.
Yes.
But when the Ukraine crisis hit, of course, that priority was all of a sudden not a priority anymore because financial sustainability was all of a sudden threatened.
Yeah.
So, and based on my observations, the notion that sustainability can be a source of competitive advantage in the global economy is not yet as pervasive
Yes.
in boardrooms as
Yeah.
it should be. That's just my subjective observation from
Yeah.
3 years working in that environment.
Yeah.
So I feel like unless there are global market mechanisms that price in that negative externality and make companies pay for their emissions,
Yeah.
unless it becomes obvious to every single company in the world, be it small or big, that polluting, emitting, not being circular is going to cost me money, then I don't.
Yeah, no, I hear you.
Do you know what I'm getting at? So
I
what is
hear
the
ya.
role of markets?
Yeah,
and
no, I hear ya.
regulation to
So
make
what-
this transition happen?
You know, what ought to happen is that we would have good policy, which would mean we would price the negative externalities involved with carbon and other pollutants into our products and services, so policy would lead. Then firms could behave rationally according to the neoclassical vision of them. And boards would be fully aware of what they're doing and make decisions that would lead to these kinds of outcomes that would transform the economy. Now, that would be the first time in history that that ever happened. Because the way change has actually happened in the last few of these revolutions is that the last people to get the memo were the boards. Right? You know as well as I do that if you're sitting on a board, you don't know anything about that business. They give you a board book, they feed you a certain amount of information you're allowed to know. The people in the guts of the organization actually know what's going on. And the last people to get the memo is the person on the board. The revolution will happen despite those boards, not because of them. And because it has to happen despite them, it will be slower than it would have been. And tens of millions of people will die as a result. So I wish it would happen the way you described, but what's instead going to happen is that people are going to have to make the changes, even though the firms in the status quo don't want to make the changes. So, you know, I would like to think that the big companies that I advise, that you advise, would get on board, and I hope they do. But I'm here to tell you that this revolution is going to happen even if they don't. Because remember, if they don't, the earth will just speak a little more loudly. And then the next year, a little more loudly. And then the next year, a little more loudly. And the volume's not coming down until we change. Now, the young lady next in line, not everybody has to ask a question, but these three all put their hands up at once, so go ahead.
Thank you very much for very encouraging sharing. And my question is, how do university deal with the political cost about the environmental justice when facing the Trumpism in America, with the climate denial and also the cutoff of the diversity, equity, and inclusion funding for universities? So in this circumstance, how can university deal with the academic freedom and autonomy and to justify the environmental justice
Yes.
with the distant others?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. And I want to preface my answer by saying that I fully realize that I can say the words I'm going to say because I come from a particularly affluent university. Okay, so, but in universities, our job is to speak the truth. And when it comes to politics, this too will pass. Now, imagine Kamala had won. Just imagine, okay? Everybody's wearing blazers now. A bunch of the staff at Stanford, or they all have their Kamala blazers, right? Kamala won. I don't know, John Kerry's Secretary of the Interior, right? And just imagine, so you wouldn't be here, you'd be in some high up job in the government. We would still have a really big problem. We'd all feel better. But it's not like we were doing a good job before. Now, I know the Inflation Reduction Act was an amazing set of policies. The most progressive and constructive environmental policies the United States has ever put into play. They still don't hold a candle to Europe. So we have absolutely harmed the environment by electing that man. And we have created a great deal of suffering and death. But we weren't in good shape before either. So, you know, it may come just with my age, but I gotta tell you, this too will pass. That said, it does make it all the more important that people like the people in this room behave as the environmental producer they can be to make a difference the way you can in your role. Maybe one more question, and then we'll go have more questions over drinks, but I gave this row privilege of 3 questions. And Charlie, you and I talk all the time. I want to give one, I had several hands went up back over there. Okay, then Charlie, you get to ask your question.
First of all, thank you very much for your insightful presentation on sustainability revolution. The problem what we face is just, most industrialized countries are not responsible for carbon emissions. Were there any, strong sanctions against not just keeping this buying like carbon credits or something to prevent this climate change? Thank you.
Okay, yeah, so you've really got 2 questions in there, Charlie. One is the issue of carbon credits and maybe we won't go into that. I think we have an understanding in this crowd in particular, the way that carbon credits would operate and how important it would be to do that. So they understand that. The question of who's responsible, I mean, the carbon is forever. No, it's not forever, but the point is that the time it takes carbon to break down is much longer than the time horizons that we're talking about if you start at industrialization and work up through the situation we're in now. So that means you have to look at the total cumulative carbon dioxide released since industrialization. And that would be largely from my country and from Europe. And for that reason, one of the big environmental justice questions when we ask who pays, it would have to be that burden should fall on those who were responsible for creating it. And that's just my opinion. This is a moral argument that I'm making because it's what I believe to be the case. And that would mean that people in the countries that you saw in my pictures, the Philippines, Indonesia, Brazil, Chile, but the list goes on, India, Bangladesh, China, even though many of those economies, take the Chinese economy, people now point to them and say, oh my goodness, you're producing a great deal of carbon dioxide. That is true. And they need to move away from carbon intensive energy. But the fact of the matter is most of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere right now is there because of the prosperity that benefited me and my fellow Americans, and those of you who are European, you and your fellow Europeans. And so we need to be very sober about this. I'll never forget, I was giving a talk like this in the Philippines, and I think I got like 2 sentences in, and Dennis Montecillo, one of our wonderful alumni, you may know him, Karen, raised his hand right away. I said, well, Dennis, what is it? He said, who pays? Right? And I understood immediately, all right, here comes a white guy from America to tell the people of the Philippines what they ought to do in the face of climate change. So I mean, Charlie, we're facing one of the greatest inequities that it may be the greatest inequity that has ever come along in the history of humankind, that one area of the globe has enjoyed tremendous prosperity and then turns to the rest of the globe and says, but not you, because we enjoy the environment the way it is now, and we'd prefer to wall off the Amazon or what have you. And that's the biggest reason, Charlie, that I make these arguments around environmental justice. And all right, well, look, on that, let's continue our Q&A over drinks.